Hey everyone, I'm Noctis Corvus, but you can call me Noctis. Today is a video which is part of a slightly older series here on the channel that I haven't worked on in a while. There have been a few reasons for this too, mainly that other inspirations have hit lately, and there are alternative ideas that I wanted to work on first. And those have been what I've been looking at lately around here. Yet this week we are adding to the set based on dreams and nightmares, where I'm drawing an image based off a more recent dream I've had, which is what has inspired me to look at this series and these ideas again. Yet without much delay, let's discuss the details and process and sort of just get into it without much need for fuss or faff. See, this idea began entirely with the dream, as everything else in this series has. And yes, I would classify this as a dream again. We will eventually add nightmares to this set, just like the title implies, but this was an image that I couldn't really wait to draw since, when I woke up, it was sort of stuck with me and it was really clear. And I suppose that isn't an unusual thing to say for myself. I usually have vivid dreams more often than not, which is where this idea for this set originated from. Yet this time, it was something that stuck with me for the next few days, as opposed to some of the other dreams where I document them in the first hour of being awake before I lose the image. This one, I still documented it early, but then kind of let myself move on and forget it, only for it to stay as vivid as when I woke up until I gave it more attention. From there, as I will touch on more later, I let myself look at it as a piece of art instead. Though let's just kind of get into the dream itself here, shall we? See, the dream began fairly simple. It was like any other dream where I had been walking through the forest, which isn't an unusual start for me. I often picture fields and forests or scenes of an abyss and never-ending environments. I've drawn another dream that began the same, walking through a forest. Yet this time it had been calm and bright. There had been signs of life and plants just as any would expect. As it progressed, I came up towards the end of a path, or at least what I will call the end this time, if that makes sense. There was a feeling that it continued on, or there was more around it, yet the path was broken, so to say. The bushes came together to mark an end or a natural barrier, where this clock then stood. Now, it was strange. In the dream, the clock was the same from all angles viewed at, as if it had been spinning to track those around it, or there was only ever one front face visible. It was then strange, as I said. The path seemed to shift too, as I went around the clock to look at it. What I mean by that was that the path back always had been behind me, even when I was on the opposite side where it should have been facing me. The dream didn't last much longer from that point. See, as the clock struck the time that I drew, the first crack began to form. It was only small, and one from the centre of the clock, yet it was on the face. And it had only been small. Yet the crack then began to grow in the seconds that followed, and more formed on the clock itself. This hadn't been too unusual or out of place. It was just a broken clock, and that had been entirely fine. Yes, it was in the middle of the forest, and there wasn't really a purpose for me being there either, yet it made sense that only the clock would be breaking. Yet, within what felt like the next few minutes, it continued to grow, and it gets a bit stranger from there. The clock itself began to crumble at the sides and sort of flake away, but it wasn't in line with the cracks at the centre. The flaking and fragments began from the right side like I drew, and they would just chip away before vanishing. Only the occasional piece would then come to float near where it had been, as if it was trying to remember how it once fit together for a moment longer. Yet most of them vanished and faded as I could only really watch it happen. And at this point, it was still the clock, and it still made a degree of sense to me at the time. If anything, it'd still been pretty. It was a sort of scene I remember from the dream and being unable to turn away from. Just kind of watching it crack and splinter at one side before those pieces then faded into light and vanished, with some still holding on despite no longer fitting back into the original place. Yet, partway through that phase, the cracking then came to continue. Now, it's kind of hard to explain. Yet the cracks began to come out of the clock itself. It spread to the air first, and the lines turned black as they continued to spread and grow. They sought to claim more and gave off this impression of wrong, even though there was no effort made to move in the dream, and I continued to watch it with the same awe as the clock breaking. It felt wrong but not dangerous, as daft as it may sound, and it began to eventually spread to the ground and bushes, claim parts of the trees, and it never really interacted with anything. It is kind of hard to explain, but it was more like someone had painted over reality, rather than having it wrap into the world like in a 3D sense. It was more like a 2D picture just dropped over it. Pieces then began to fall away from that point as the cracks grew worse. It began with small, tiny flecks that were gone before hitting the floor, and then larger shards that were left at the side of the crack until they came to fade too, like the clock. At this point the clock had frozen at this time, and even its own decay had come to a halt as the cracks grew worse and wilder. They grew faster, and bits chipped away a little more as it just kind of stood and watched it. It was an odd sense. Wonder and calm, yet the world remained breaking around. It was strange as it was around the environment, yet it still felt that it was 2D in a sense. I then ended up waking up before the entire world was took over. It wasn't a jolt or anything fast. There wasn't a trace of emotions that I associate to a nightmare, which is again why I'm inclined to call this a dream more than anything, since it wasn't scary to me at any point. There was the wrongness of the shattering, but nothing alarming by it, or anything that made a sense of danger. If anything, I was more confused still, and made a note of it before I forgot. But that is the entire dream, so from here I can begin talking about how I took that into this image you've been watching. Now, my first choice had been picking the moment I wanted to focus on. The cracking of the abyss, the world turning to shards, had been the main point of the dream, yet it was something that I could also tie into the other stages with as well. I mean, by that point, the clock had been damaged and frozen, so it made sense to me that this is where I chose before anything else. Picking the walk made very little sense. It was the calm before everything, so it would have made a less interesting focus too. So it naturally came to feature the world breaking alongside everything else. Yet in the idea phase, there had been a few main themes that I'd been looking at. The first had naturally been the clock and the cracking. I will be clear, I don't know if dreams carry meanings or what they would mean. I know people believe they do, and many would say that yes, they do carry a meaning, yet I've never been good at working out the meanings to my own dreams. So at this point, I looked at what would make a good theme for art, and something that I would want to work with in that sense. And, well, this dream has been quite kind to me. After all, I think I will always be fascinated with themes of time and how it passes, and this dream made a strong candidate to tie into this. I mean, even if I didn't want to include the theme of time in this, it would have been very likely that someone would view it as such, and avoiding this connection would be harder. So I sort of then had been able to look at it and work with this. I could choose the framing, the layout, and kind of make progress on it in a meaningful way. And I chose the moment where the destruction had been at the further stage. More on that detail of it later. And I chose this as it best captured the theme of decaying time, and I could play a lot more with the visuals to match the one of the dream. At that moment, I also chose to pull the image out a little bit, so that the person is part of the scene too, and that was to put the viewer in a sort of observing role to the events unfolding, rather than them being the ones to experience it themselves. Yet, as always, I had the colour palette remaining to work out once I had the sketch sorted, and this time it had been a bit of back and forth. I mean, originally I wanted a blue palette. There had been that hue to things, and it worked well with the yellow, I recall, and I always tie yellow into time, and it tied into the clock during the dream. And yes, it was something I could work with, in theory, and I did try plotting it out in basic forms before I began recording. I kind of just threw down sections as part of the sketch, since I knew in my mind that I wasn't sold on the impression that it would make. And sure enough, I wasn't. With it all laid out in blues and turquoise, or greens, it was far too cold, and yes, the yellow was nice, but it wasn't quite as I had planned it. My second draft then made it look as if it had been underwater or something, instead of above and in a forest. Either that or it made it look like it was too late and in the middle of the night somehow. And this second path may have worked. Maybe. But again, it wasn't the impression that I wanted. They were just too cold and almost eerie with the contents I'd been looking at and working with. So I went down another route and considered making the palette something closer to a purple. Like, I kind of shifted the palette so that the darkest points were a clear purple, and then tied it into the blue either way like before. It was nice, something I often gravitate towards, and the yellow was a very nice complement to the piece as well in this palette. I mean, they are complementary anyway, so it sort of made sense to at least test that route. However, sure enough, like the other palettes, it was far too cold to achieve the intent that I had. It shared the issues as the blue, where it was too eerie and it made the environment feel creepy in a sense, rather than capturing any feelings that I had been going for. And maybe I would have eventually gotten there, or been able to look at some trick to guide it towards what I wanted. Yet the mist and the details just kind of made it have this sense of unease throughout it, and it pushed the coldness too much, which isn't part of the dream, and doesn't properly convey the theme that I wanted it to. This then leads us into the final palette, which is the one I ended up settling on, eventually. I decided that taking this route fit everything that little bit better, and so I subtly shifted the palette towards red and that sort of region. It had the warmth that I'd been going for, and it still worked alongside the yellow. It was unnatural with the hues present, rather than opting for green grass and leaves. Yet that added to the dream sense that I had been working from and sort of aiming for in this moment. Furthering this, the warmer tones tied better in with the details that I wanted to look at further. I went with it. And it really brought together the feeling of the forest. Yes, parts may end up dark for that sense of wrongness. I will touch on more of it in the detail phase of this discussion, yet it was contrasted well with the yellow present and the later lighting effects added where needed. Those finishing touches needed the darkness elsewhere to really stand out without being too bright or out of place, yet it was still worked with the warmth present in the colours. And as part of this, I did still include some of the other colours throughout the outcome, with the bluish purple in the grass and a few red purples throughout the figure as well as other aspects. All in all, once I tested the red palette, I sort of knew that it would best capture the dream, even if it is hard to put into words. It's not as creepy or eerie, and there isn't that sense of coldness throughout it. But with all of that said, let's use the time remaining here to discuss the details of the piece. And the first up here is the figure and the person in the forest. Now, I did take a few creative liberties here. The first is the actual framing of the image itself, which kind of leaves the person visible to the viewer, where the dream had been from the person's perspective. I ended up doing this mainly for two reasons. The first of the two is that it fits the image better. There is something to look at alongside the clock and the splinter, whilst the space before it felt unusually empty. Compared to everything around it, it just didn't sit right, and it made it look a little empty, or that the clock wasn't right since it had been going into the ground, like it was in the dream. And it had also been covered by bushes, which made it a bit too obscure. My second reason for the shift had been sort of strange. Trying to draw the dream how I'd experienced it wasn't working, and it never quite captured the right impression of the cracking and the shards. It always felt too dangerous or off-putting. It was always hard to create a sense of calm where the viewer was the one to experience it, and I did try it multiple times. At one point, I considered making this an animation project instead, where I could show the development, yet that plotting out had also come into the same challenges as the drawing, as they both faced challenges of the danger and the emotions connecting to it. There wasn't really a way to show it from the experience firsthand. So I pulled the drawing back and reframed how it would be shown. I drew this as a way to share it, like a second-hand account where the goal is to give an impression of the experience, or to tell a story of it rather than putting the viewer in the shoes to experience it. It's why you see the person and the cracking is the way it is. It's also why I framed it like this, rather than the earlier sketches where the viewer had been looking up at the clock, or they'd been standing near a crack in the world. Yet the person is also another point of creative liberty. In the dream, I felt that it was myself experiencing it, and I decided against drawing that. A person in pyjamas, known to be myself or not, didn't quite fit the impression of the outcome, and it drew too much attention away from the surroundings and the main focal points that I went with. Besides, colour palette wise, it didn't fit how I intended, but this way did. And I can't talk much on why I added the details I did to her. I just went with what felt right and what tied into the world best. I knew I wanted the hair to be bright, and this sort of pinkish red made sense within this context, and it had been a more fun choice compared to brown or any other natural tone. It also helped her sort of blend into the environment more, and again, reduce how much attention they grabbed. For the dress, I added the flowers to fit the forest, and again went with the colours around her, but tilted it more towards a purple undertone, as a goal to both let her stand out a little bit, but also still fit in at least a little bit. As for the final detail with the person, the little light or the flame in her hand, that is something I added as a bit of interest and fun. It's a hint of magic to indicate that this wouldn't be our world either way, and that a touch of magic is present too. It also makes it look as if she's using it to find her way through the path, and it kind of is like a guide of sorts, to make sense within the darker context that I would later add. Though at the end of the day, it is mainly there since it is fun, and I felt that it would fit the scene quite well. But I mean, that does kind of wrap up all that I can say with her. So let's look at the main details of the piece here, shall we? The clock itself went through many iterations in the sketches. It had been a clock in the dream, yet I did toy with the idea in sketching of making it into an hourglass that had been shattered with the sand falling out, yet still infinitely falling from the top half, or coming to an end of its sand. It would have fit better when the idea had been looking up at the item from the view of a person experiencing it, and I could have done a few things to experiment with it in that version. Yet it ultimately didn't go ahead, as I chose to follow the dream more than stray from it. It also felt right to continue with the clock, so I did, and I followed through with that as is seen. And I have spoken about why the clock is shattered and the cracks, yet I want to touch on the other details around it. The first of these smaller elements had been the frame, and how I chose to include that. The frame itself hadn't been anything special until the clock began to break. Yet, on the side that it didn't break and the part of the top, there had been the decoration and the light that I included in those spaces, though at the top half it got cut off. It was on the other sides too, but they later faded away. But the light wasn't a harsh light. It was something more like a firefly, if that makes sense, but still bright red. As I said, there had been one on the other side too, the side that broke, that is. Yet the formation around the light crumbled first, and the light itself sort of just floated off into the forest and the sky, before the rest of it continued to break as it did. It's why I decided to include it on the left of the drawing. It was subtle, yet it also worked really well to tie this into the sort of colour palette as well. As for the other aspects of the clock, like the numbers and the lines, I included those that I remember and that weren't covered. To see the entire clock, I had to get closer and look over the bushes. Yet they were only simple, and the clock face hadn't been too important until it began to break. It was always plain, with only the numbers and 4 lines to mark each quarter. There weren't any lines for things like 10 and 11 or any of the other numbers, which is why I didn't draw them into this drawing. And they lacked the lines between that would usually be on a clock to denote the minutes and such. Even if the clock had that, I kind of doubt that I would have included it anyway in this piece. It would have been a bit too much going on for the clock at that point, which is why I sort of only ended up with this. However, as I mentioned, the clock hands stopped at the time that I drew. They had been 2 simple and pointy arrows, so again, fairly simple to include and remember. But it was rather interesting in the dream. In the sketch, I drew the time as I remembered the arrow placements. not the exact time itself. I don't think I ever really recognised or considered it being an actual time, which is why I record the placement more than anything. And yet, from this time came the first crack that came to consume the world. So, why don't we discuss that detail next? It is also kind of the final major detail at the very least. So the cracks in the dream expanded beyond any sort of confinement. They just sprawled in all directions and went wherever they could. Yet I sort of knew that that wouldn't work for the drawing as I intended. It would have been too hectic or too confusing, with the cracks making it too unclear what anything was or what was going on. They would have consumed the clock if I'd let myself draw it accurately, and that wasn't quite what I'd been intending. This is why I went ahead with this route in the end. I chose to draw a single crack at a later point of growth, where the space and abyss had below been coming through, and most of the environment in that section had shattered and faded away. It had other fractures coming off it, and it looks as if it will only continue to spread and grow further, as it's already consuming a significant portion of the drawing. Originally this would have been it too. I would have left it at this stage with a single crack and then drawn normally. Yet it wasn't quite right and it didn't make much sense. So I added another crack where it's at an earlier stage of development. It's thin, narrow, and yet expanded too much, yet at the end of it is beginning to shatter away from the world and grow wider. This small crack has cracks forming off of it as well, and it looks as if it too will only continue to grow. Doing this route balanced it further, and it kind of furthered the idea that the cracks had been spreading and growing in more than one direction, and it also had claimed much more than a single corner. It was less contained too, which worked, and it finalised the sketching phase by balancing the drawing, which this later translated into a better balanced outcome. Now, shading these had been a guessing game. I'll be honest when I say that I had no clue how to convey what the cracks were doing, and even less clue how to make them hold a form of dimension, beyond kind of looking like a sticker lazily put over the top. Yes, it was over reality in the dream, yet it still felt like it belonged and had been part of something. It also felt that near the end, it needed something to simply tie it all together, and to tie it all in before I added the space-like environment inside of it. So I decided to mess around and stumbled across the result the first try. It began with a lighting layer. I used a glow as it is my favourite. I added this along one side of the cracks, and sort of used it to highlight the side of them below the actual mark itself. It's like the light is catching on a raised edge or something at one side of the crack. On the other, I added a second layer, which was set to multiply, just to add a bit of a darker tint to things that furthered the element of this fracture being part of the world and cutting into it slightly. All of this really highlighted the edges and the lines that kind of made it part of the splintering, and it drew that little bit of extra attention towards it. Now, finally, I finished off this aspect with details of space. That was quick and simple. A little bit here and there with purples and blues with a fluffy watercolour brush kind of finished it off with less work than I usually would put in, and that it would usually take. Often I have to layer the colours and blend them out and introduce all sorts of stages and effects to properly sell the idea that this is space in a way. Yet this time, with it being a small area compared to a whole page, I was able to wrap it up nicely and kind of finish off everything without too much faff and hassle. Being said, with the time left, I want to touch on a few of the small details I included for myself now. The main of these is the moth seen dotted around the space. Now, the moth as an animal is often tied to ideas of change and transformation. Some people tie them into death and the afterlife as well. In the dream itself, there were things in the forest like ordinary animals, and, as the fracture began, there had been things flying around, which is why I chose to include these moths. It is a tie of personal bias too, since I really adore moths as an animal, yet they were oddly fitting here. The dream took on a theme of time, and the clock broke down in a state of change. The fracture as well could relate to the implication of a moth via transformation, so they fit and I wanted to include them. In the early stages though, before I knew the colour palette, I wasn't sure which moth I would end up choosing. That came to depend on the palette itself, and well, it did come to work in my favour. I have a list of favoured moths, and those are the ones that I'm a little biased towards, but I wouldn't say that I have a favourite between them. One of these moths on the list is the cinnabar moth. I love the colours of them and they look really cool. To list every moth I prefer would take a while, but the focus is on the cinnabar this time. With the red palette, their bold and bright red really came to tie into everything else as well, and it sort of meant that there was no doubt with myself that I would choose this one out of all of the options. Besides, it stands out slightly and they catch the eye. They draw attention, and this is something that I had been aiming for, rather than them being too hard to see that they're not visible at all. Yes, they don't snatch the attention away immediately, yet it's noticed when looking at the outcome, which is what I really came to enjoy with all of this. And it is sort of settled my desire to draw moths again, though there's no doubt they'll appear sooner or later again. Now, the final detail that I want to discuss here is the yellow. I don't know why I do this, yet I always tie yellow into the idea of time. Like, if I ever have to draw a physical embodiment of time, either as threads or liquid or even characters, yellow will be found somewhere within that palette, and it is usually front and centre for it too. Do I know entirely why I do this? Not a clue, and there's not a chance that I'd work it out. I have tried to work it out or look at the different colours for it, yet I always come back to yellow, and it never looks right to me until it is like this. So here we are. The threads on the outside was to sort of frame it all as well, and the yellow ties it into time, and it also cements the idea that this is all relating to time as a piece. These threads around it are also a nod to the clock's decay, as that happened with thin slivers of these threads breaking between them. Yes, the threads in this form weren't really present in the dream, yet it still worked as a framing piece. What was present was the waterfall. I will kind of call it that as I lack any better term for it. It stayed to the side and it flowed rather slowly out of grains and threads more than a liquid. I knew in this image that I couldn't change the colour in any sense with the way it moved in the dream, as it was another thing that was always to the side of the clock, right where I drew it. It moved with me, yet kept flowing even as the fractures grew worse. As the fractures grew worse, it was even the only thing that still moved. It is part of the dream that stuck with me as well. It's why, as small of a detail as it is, it kind of had to be included here, and I wouldn't take it out. It was also a strange part of the world that I couldn't make sense of. It came from nowhere, and it didn't really go anywhere to make up for the eternal amount that was flowing. It was an endless flow of sand, and yet it flowed like water once it reached the ground, and it kind of went down the side of the path that I followed to reach the clock in the first place. Yet that was only for a few minutes, and nowhere was enough for it to account for everything that had flowed. In the end though, I would say that everything came together. The sand filled that corner nicely, and the threads framed the piece in a way that I wanted it to, without taking too much attention off anything else. In all of it, I would say that I captured the feeling of the dream, and the finishing effects cemented this as well. Those are the finishing effects that I did off camera, and I have kind of run out of time here to discuss them. They weren't anything too fancy though, and there isn't much that I would be able to say about them anyway that I've never said before. They were just more some extra shadows and gradients to bring everything together though. But in saying that, that is all we have time for this week. I really hope you've enjoyed this piece, and thank you so much for watching this far. I will see you another time, but for now, goodbye, and have a wonderful day.